So, a reflection on the concept of Middle Age is that we have today, and what is really all about medieval history as a concept. Well, first of all, I'd say that we usually think of the Middle Ages as a millennium that is roughly comprehended, even with some debate, obviously, and substantial debate between the 5th and the 15th century of our age. But especially it takes into consideration a European dimension, without which it's really very difficult to reason even in terms of Middle Ages. But this whole idea includes another fundamental notion, or better two. Essentially, the first one is the idea of a before that is made up of substantially an ancient age, which had essentially the peak of civilization in the Hellenistic and Roman culture of the Mediterranean area. So an area that is really, borderline between Europe and other continents. And another notion is what came after. That is essentially the modern age, which is often conceived as an effort of rationalization of the relationship acting between the let's say all within the Roman the human society. Excuse me, I'm not the Roman society only, because there wasn't even no more such a thing. And as you understand, what you find in here, there is a strong difference between the idea of ancient age and one of modern age, which is based on different aspects, on different areas, and especially on a different approach deriving from these respective cultures. So what is interesting is how we conceive what is in the middle, that is the Middle Ages. So a moment that you know basically made these societies playing together, let's say, but essentially what transformed the first into the second. And obviously, when we look at the ancient world, we realize that there was a pretty much structured civil society. We have substantially a world that was that gravitated around the aristocracies of the central and eastern Mediterranean. So also here you find that it's not really Europe, right? It's also parts of today's Near East, of Anatolia, North Africa, and so on. While the modern world and the modern idea, in this case of Europe, which obviously this opens to another point, that is how much Eastern Europe really participated into the process of Western, the building of Western civilization. I think it did. There are people who actually argue whether Eastern Europe had a decisive effort, or it was a sort of westernized afterwards. And the idea of the modern world is instead centered on, in fact, the western half of the European continent. So a half that eventually tends to expand in many ways, that took place even during the Middle Ages itself, but even partly during the modern the ancient era. and that space from the Atlantic to Eastern Europe, and go even beyond. I mean, it goes beyond until it expanded into other continents, and basically came to dominate all the other civilization. During colonialism, the European power was at its peak, and many other civilizations were basically swallowed by the Europeans and transformed accordingly. Um, so it's quite important to understand that what was formed at the beginning of the modern era, in which there is this phase of expansion, obviously had its roots and base during the Middle Ages, and this is the period where the characteristics of the Western world um, come to be not really to be defined firmly, because during the modern age there is a continuous process of transformation, but at least that gave the material, the the elements of which it was made up. So the Middle Ages represents, in a certain sense, this transition and link between the equilibrium that the ancient world, with its Italic, Greek, and Eastern societies and cultures, and the expansive and even conquering dynamics that would eventually reach their peak during the modern and contemporary era, and that have much to do not just with Mediterranean but also with the Atlantic. So peoples that during the ancient era were in a way marginal to contribute to the construction of the European identity, at least in comparison to the influence that other cultures from the Mediterranean eventually had. Not that they weren't important, it's just relative. However, you might argue that this is a simplistic explanation, because it wasn't just a geographical shift that determined this civil development. And we also have to notice that the medieval millennium is actually quite a long time. And even in this time we can find